If a hypocrite is someone who believes one thing but lives another, which it is, then all Christians must plead guilty, because we're never fully consistent in living out our faith, and we're sometimes very inconsistent. None of us wants to be a hypocrite, which is why this morning's Bible passage is such good news. It means we can cope when the charge of hypocrisy is laid against us. Please turn to page 958 in the Church Bibles, Matthew chapter 23, beginning at verse 13. Jesus says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to." The kingdom of heaven is the situation where everyone submits to God as king. That won't fully happen, finally happen, until Jesus comes again as judge of all and saviour of those who turn to him. But Jesus talked about entering the kingdom now, by which he meant coming back into relationship with God as king in this life, while there's still time. Jesus pictures it as if there is a door. We're on one side and God is on the other. How do you get through the door back into relationship with a God? The teachers of the law and Pharisees said, by keeping the law. To which Jesus says, you shut the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. Telling people they have to earn their way back into God's good books is effectively to shut the door on them coming back to him, because that is not the way. Jesus told his disciples in chapter 16, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." What he's saying is, once I died on the cross, and you understand that it pays for the forgiveness of sins, you will have in your hands the key that lets people through that door. And the key is forgiveness. A boy whose father was a bishop asked him about the large, ornate, metal pectoral cross he wore. "Daddy, is that a key?" The bishop turned his son's question into a teaching/evangelistic moment. Actually, yes, it is. He took the opportunity to explain the gospel to his son, to explain how the death of Jesus paid for our forgiveness. Do you look for and seek to take such opportunities, not least with children and grandchildren? There was no other good enough to pay the price of sin. He only could unlock the gate of heaven and let us in. The teachers of the law and Pharisees believed and preached Christ-less, cross-less, grace-less religion. They left people pushing the door by trying to be good enough, and it can only be opened from God's side by forgiveness. Beware of Christ-less religion. Don't be impressed by its zeal or spread or size. None of those things are measures of truth. Verse 15. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. The teachers of the law and Pharisees lived out their false religion with zeal. The Jehovah's Witnesses are a modern-day example of that. It's no surprise that they're zealous. They think God's acceptance depends on how many converts they make. But it's misdirected zeal. That's trying to earn God's acceptance, as is the case with every other man-made, man-centered religion. Followers of other religions spend their life in search of God's acceptance, trying to please him in the hope of his acceptance at the end. But as Christians, we are able to live our life in grateful response to God's acceptance. We try to please him because he's already accepted us. If we have accepted him and what he has already done for us through Jesus' death on the cross. Are you living your life from the starting point of God's acceptance, from the starting point of trusting Christ and his cross? Or have you somehow forgotten grace and slipped into living in search of God's acceptance? If you're a believer, may I remind you that the key that got us in and keeps us in is not how well you do, but the forgiveness of your sin. May I remind you that grace means God doesn't accept you any more on our best day or any less on your worst. Keep trusting that, even in the face of any sense of failure and unworthiness. If you don't know this relationship with God, please know that it's entered into not by being good enough, but by being forgiven. That forgiveness is available to all, whoever you are, whatever you've done, by trusting in what Jesus has done for you. If you were to believe, wrongly, that God's acceptance depends on keeping the law, unless you're totally self-deceived, a huge tension builds up. Because God's standards are always higher than your behavior. And you must know in your heart of hearts that you're not good enough and never will be, which is a terrible tension to deal with. How can you seek to relieve that tension. You can either seek to redefine sin, or you can seek to redefine obedience. And people do that. You can seek to redefine sin so that you can say, you haven't sinned. That's what's going on in verses 16 to 22. The teachers of the law and Pharisees came up with all sorts of categories of oaths that you didn't really have to keep. They said, if you break this kind of oath, it's not really sin. It's a bit like our category of a white lie. It's only a bit of a lie, not really a sin at all. God is totally truthful. And the law tells us that if we're in relationship with him, then we are to be totally truthful in our words and promises and commitments. But the reality is that our behaviour falls far short. We exaggerate and tell lies and half-truths and break promises. What sins are you in the habit of redefining? For what sinful behaviour are you saying to yourself, a bit of this is okay? Is a bit of bitterness okay? After all, surely God can't expect me to be totally forgiven, especially after what's been done to me. Or a bit of greed or sexual impurity is okay. After all, God can't expect me to be totally different from the culture. What sins are we redefining? For what are we saying? A bit of this is okay. I wonder what comes to your mind. More positively, how can we avoid doing that? We do it because we've forgotten grace. We do it to ease that tension of God's standards being up there and our behaviour being down here, by bringing God down to our level. But that's not the way. The way is to say, I'm going to aim for nothing less than God's standards. And when I feel the tension between that and my behaviour, I'm going to trust his grace. I'm going to trust that that constant shortfall gap between his standards and my life is covered by ongoing forgiveness. Instead of pretending that sin isn't sin, or just settling for a certain level of sin, I'm going to come to God again and again, confess my sins, ask his forgiveness, and set off again to resist sin. The other way people seek to relieve that tension is to seek to redefine obedience to God, so that you can say, you've done it. Verse 23. Jesus said, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel." That's an example of redefining obedience by being selective. It's been said, the trouble with the 10 Commandments is that, unlike some exam papers, they don't say at the top, Attempt not more than 7 out of 10. But a way to try to make obedience easier is to be selective, to attempt less than God asks of us. The teachers of the law and Pharisees majored on some minor parts of God's will that were relatively easy, and neglected the major parts of God's will, which are so demanding we can never actually say we've done them. God called those living under the Old Covenant to tithe, to give 1/10 of their income and produce. The teachers of the law and Pharisees majored on things like tithing their spices, which was easy and made them feel they'd been obedient. But Jesus says, verse 23, "But you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness." What about the needs of the poor? What about those whose rights are being denied? From the unborn child to the persecuted church. What about the bereaved or sick or elderly who need our care? What about our marriage promises or our contractual commitments? Jesus says, "You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel," i.e., you've lost all proportion as to what matters most to God. We need to ask, how are we redefining obedience to God? What do we choose to major on so we can feel that we've done our obedience? It's easy to major on just a few things as if that was obedience done, box ticked. And of course, they're always the relatively easy things, the self-contained and less demanding things. But what are we neglecting? What minor things are we majoring on, and what major things are we neglecting? I wonder what comes to your mind. Again, more positively, how can we avoid doing that? By living by grace. If we forget grace, we simply can't live with that tension between God's unmanageably big call to love him with all our heart and our neighbours as ourselves. The tension between that and our actual behaviour. If we forget grace, we're forced to reduce obedience to just a few minor manageable things so that we can somehow say our obedience is done. But that's not the way. The way, again, is to say, I'm going to aim for nothing less than God's total call on me. And when I feel the tension between that and my behaviour, I'm going to trust his grace. In verses 23 and 24, the teachers of the law and Pharisees redefined obedience by being selective. But you can also seek to redefine obedience as being all about externals. Verse 25. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Now they did literally clean cups and dishes to be ritually clean, but Jesus is speaking metaphorically about their actual lives. He continues, blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead men's bones and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. You project an image of being spiritual by all your externals and rituals, but underneath there's no real obedience to God from your heart. What externals can we mistake for obedience, or even hide behind in our disobedience stroke half-heartedness? There are all sorts of externals which we mustn't equate with spiritual health. You can rattle through a Sunday service here, say and sing the words on the service sheet, even take communion, and yet be spiritually at a low ebb, or even spiritually nowhere. Yeah, you can read a lesson, pray in public, chip in at a small group meeting, wear a name badge, but those are all externals. We shouldn't equate them with spiritual health. Jesus says, verse 26, first clean the inside of the cup and dish. Don't deal first with how you appear to others. Deal first and personally and privately with God. We're not to cover up problems with externals. We're to take the problem to God in prayer. Confess it to him. Ask his forgiveness. Ask that by his Spirit he might change us, strengthen our faith, strengthen our love for him, strengthen our resistance to sin, whatever it is we need. The answer is yet again grace. If we forget grace, we'll simply end up pretending to one another that all is well, when in reality it isn't. But if we live by grace, it frees us to stop pretending, to admit to God and one another that we're not what we should be, and to ask God to forgive us and change us further. We're never fully consistent in living out our faith, and we're sometimes very inconsistent. The message of this morning's Bible passage is: there are two groups of hypocrites here this morning, and all of us belong to one of them. There are those hypocrites who admit it to God and find his grace. And there are those who don't. The question the Bible leaves us with is, which kind of hypocrite are you? Amen.